Okay, so welcome to the Node.js Community Package Maintenance Team meeting for October 22nd, 2019. We'll follow our standard agenda, which was in issue 269. And we'll start out with seeing if there's any announcements that people would like to share. Okay, if we don't have any announcements for this week, let's move on to the issues which are tagged for the agenda. Sorry, I'm just taking quick notes here as we go along. Okay, so the first one which was tagged for the agenda is number 265, which is decide on contents for a package maintenance team issue template. Is whoever tagged that in the call? If so, maybe you can guide that discussion. I'll just go take a look in parallel.
Yeah, so we're just getting some laptops here because we had a few troubles getting.
Okay. Because yeah, I think it was Edgar who added it to the agenda. So if
he's running to get his machine because we're using a tablet.
Okay. So while we do that, while he does that, I will move on to the next one. Then once he's back, let me know and we'll come back. So the next issue is number 260, which is blog, please test in LTS. So Dominicus, I think you probably have the latest update on that.
Yeah, well, because 12 and 13 came out yesterday and today, I'm going to need to do a couple of small tweaks on wording, but I will do that directly in the doc that I've already shared with the person who will be responsible on putting that on Medium, and it should be going out either on Thursday or on Monday. So that's that. I think we can merge the PR, or we can close it. I'm not sure if we want to keep around the markdown for that.
I think like probably adding the link to the blog when it goes out and then closing makes sense. That way we can find it in the future, something like that.
Yeah, okay, cool. Let's do that then.
Okay.
Can I ask really quick, what is our standard method for promoting these blog posts when they go out? Is there something we can all team up to make sure the word gets out better?
That's a good question. It will go out under the Foundation Medium, and we don't have a standard way yet to like notify this team. We should, if at mentioning, do you think at mentioning the team in the issue is good enough, or what other ideas do people have to, because yeah, that's a great idea to figure out how we do a good job of that.
Yeah, I think that would work for me. I would just tweet out a link probably. Yeah, I don't know how else everybody else's promotion networks are, but mine is very small, so it's about all I can add.
Okay, does that sound good to everybody else? So basically, if
Yep.
Dominicus can just add the link to the blog with a hey, please retweet.
That would be perfect.
Okay. And we will get it retweeted, obviously, by the Foundation account as well, which gives us some coverage. But yeah, each of us all sending it out will be great. And a link to blog. I guess one thing we should think about, just as a aside, plant the seed, is it's great to do it the first time, but we should maybe also even think about how we like go back and promote some of these things retrospectively, or like at some interval, or just because not everybody will notice the first time things go out.
Maybe leverage some type of content manager that you can like line up tweets or whatever. I think I've used one of those in the past for some type of brand type thing where you can load up tweets you want to send out at intervals. Like you can even schedule them out like weeks or such in advance. So maybe something along those lines.
I think it's like our work is to figure out what we want. I think the Foundation Twitter account does have that kind of capability. So if we said, hey, we want to have these retweeted at this time, these retweeted at that time, we can easily make that request.
Gotcha. Okay.
In terms of us remembering and retweeting ourselves, I'm not sure, like we don't have an instance of something like that we can all log in and use ourselves. But we could come up with some other way to remind ourselves, right? I mean, like, for example, I just mentioned that we probably need to think about what and how we'd want to do that. One thing off the top of my head we could come up with is like an issue that says, hey, here's some things we want to promote periodically, and we could have a standing issue on the agenda to kind of go through and say, hey, is this the time to go and do that again, or something like that.
I like that. One thing I'd like to add is also it might be a good idea for us to reach out to some of the more popular newsletters and podcasts. And if we make an issue like that, maybe regularly send them a link to it and just say, hey, in your next podcast or next newsletter, it'd be great if you could help us get the word out about some of these initiatives we're working on. Because I'm sure that, they're always looking for content. So.
Yeah, no, good point. Rick, since you had some ideas there, any chance you'd volunteer to create that issue and start the discussion off?
Yeah, be more than happy to.
Okay, thanks.
Just put my name on the note and I'll get to it.
Yeah, let me just say RX will create an issue to discuss how we coordinate promotion of past content on a regular basis. Okay, done.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I think we're finished on that. Oops, sorry, I just put that in the wrong place. Just gonna move that in the minutes. Okay, so the next issue in the agenda is number 241, which is future direction on support fields. I'm just opening that up. I know there has been continued discussion on that front. Anybody want to jump in, or?
Yeah, I can take the lead there. So I was the last one to comment on that issue, trying to give you some feedback. Apologize, I haven't been more active with all the work that I've got in flight on my end at NPM, but tried to give some feedback and some insight into sort of what we're looking to do. And I know that we've had numerous discussions about, the scope is probably the biggest concern for me. And for NPM just to make something happen sooner is sort of the pressure that we've got on ourselves. So we last week had some internal conversations go on, spoke with Isaac and our team, the CLI team, about what could be in scope in a minor version. So we broke off a piece of the support spec specifically around the monetary aspect of supporting maintainers, and took some of the concepts out of the backing field specifically, and also tried to leverage a ton of the prior art that exists in terms of how existing tools are supporting this information. So things like Open Collective or Veros's experiments with thanks and funding, and tried to use those to essentially pave the way for what we might be able to offer in a very first small step from NPM. So I drafted an RFC against, I think, late last week against our own RFCs repo, which sort of outlines what that might look like. Again, it's a narrower scope than the full-on support spec. So not to try to deviate or sort of go on a tangent here, but it would be, I think, taking some of the information that we're trying to bubble up in the larger schema and actually putting some tooling behind it and making it meaningful. And we would be willing to try to action on this like extremely quickly. So Roy is actually here from our team, and he's actually the one queued up to take this work and run with it. If we think that this looks like a good sort of intermediate step, again, I want to preface all that with, like, we tried to take the lens of doing something small that we thought would be the most meaningful, and also sort of circles back on a conversation we started in late August in terms of how we were going to try to move the needle forward for package maintainers, specifically with the monetary funding lens in mind. So just wanted to follow up with that. It doesn't change the conversation around the support field itself. And that was also a key. We didn't want to clobber that, because there's a lot more to be said, I think, in that realm. And I know that obviously the discussion is going to keep going on in terms of where that information is going to live. So we didn't want to steal, obviously, that key. And we thought that would be more appropriate to specifically utilize the funding key in package.json, specifically for that type of information. The only one caveat I think that has been brought up is whether or not we want to maintain multiple references, like an object in that field, which is sort of what was proposed in the backing key, which I liked, and I thought was useful, although I didn't want to have such a prescriptive reserved word listing. Again, I'm willing to de-scope that based on Feros's comments and other folks' comments, and hear what people have to say or think on that. Again, this would take a piece out of what the support schema is trying to solve and try to execute against it in some way. So I would love to hear people's feedback, and would love to give some people some time to review that as well, if they haven't already.
Yep, there's a question. So LJ's.
Yeah. So conceptually, I actually think there's not really a conflict here. Like, this potentially creates data that the support field could point to or build off on. But I wanted to, like, make sure that at least my opinions here are clear, that funding information represents an opportunity for the user to give something, to pay or whatever, the package maintainers. There's no implied contract or return, like, or quid pro quo, right? So I see no issue with, like, for example, a URL showing up in the funding field, because, like, whatever, if that URL doesn't work anymore, I can't give money to the package maintainer. Like, that's their problem, right? Like, I don't suffer because of that. The concerns I have around a URL for the support field are different, because or for the information specifically, because support is a contract, like, and it actually has legal repercussions in some countries as well. So, like, to commit to it, like, as Katie Mitchell pointed out, like, with the term best effort, was, like, legally problematic, and, you know, potentially, like, so there's the so I think that as long as the funding field is scoped in the way you described, and is designed in a way that whatever information we predict we might want to use in the support field can be kind of programmatically linked somehow, then I think that's good. Now, to me, that actually says that it should be an object, so that each kind of funding thing has an ID, essentially, because an object key is basically an ID, because that way you can address it from the support field or from tooling. I don't think it should be prescriptive. I think any key should be allowed. However, if you make the funding object have all the top level keys be available as, like, funding mechanism IDs, then you immediately close off expansion possibilities, sort of like how NPM added scopes because all unscoped names were already taken. And the same goes for, like, twitter.com/whoever. Like, Twitter had to, like, make some usernames that were unreservable so that they could give themselves a namespace for all the rest of the URLs they wanted. So, sort of in terms of future planning, it seems like perhaps, like, a funding object, it's a little more boilerplatey, but tooling can abstract around it. It's a funding object that has a key, like methods or mechanisms or something, and then that object all the keys are IDs and all the values are maybe a URL to start with and could expand to be an object later or something. But like by doing that, then you've kind of ensured any potential future expansion, even if we're not 100% sure what that might look like. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm wondering have you checked out the way I've sort of written it as it is today? It sort of steals a lot of the verbiage from the backing schema that was in this report.
I'll definitely take a deeper look at it. I have not given it a fair review yet, but I just wanted to kind of say conceptually, right? Like that's the mindset I would have in mind when I was reading it.
Totally.
Is like, you know, and I don't mind if it's stealing pieces out from the support field, right? Like that, like flat is better than nested. So like I would rather have 10 fields that each have a independent use case and schema that can interoperate than one massive field that does everything. That said, I think that I also don't think the support field is biting off too much, but like, I don't think we have to, like, I would rather see things go in than see things held up on a big solution. So I'm glad for the effort.
I think like, I'll just add the flat fields make sense until you want to have that version info that was in there. But I think like I'm on the same thing. It would be good to get something, you know, there's a desire to have some stuff. And I wonder if it's a replacement or if it's something where, like in the support backing, there's some options in terms of specifying what it is. And, you know, if sponsored could maybe be expanded, include an option which is a reference to that field.
That's exactly what I'm thinking, is that like the funding mechanism doesn't need versioning because like, yeah, maybe you could make it be an object that has a expired true field or something. I don't know. We can figure that out later, but like, you know, you can always expand a string to then be an object later. But that once the funding mechanism kind of sits by itself, and if GitHub sponsorship is a funding mechanism, that's forever valid. Now it may no longer accept new funds at some point, but it never wasn't. It is a funding mechanism at one point is never not true.
So, well, except that I may no longer take funding through it.
Right. No. And that's what I meant, like by an expired true or something. So things may stop being open for new funds, but the funding, to me, the funding field says these are funding mechanisms I have ever supported. That I maybe by default I currently support, but it's okay if I no longer support some of them. And like if with that kind of mindset around it, there doesn't need to be any versioning. There only needs to be a way to kind of expire or disable them, and that we can add iteratively. But then once this exists, like kind of in terms of like if you were designing a database schema, like funding mechanisms is a table, and the support field is a table, and there's a linking table between the two, and like the linking table is the part where you'd need the versioning, where it's like version 1 and 2 have these funding mechanisms and these supports, but version 3 has a different one, and you know, but that doesn't really kick in until you are combining funding and support obligations.
Yeah. Although anyway, I think we could get into a long discussion of that. I'm just more thinking of like, is the funding, would it replace the entire backing section, or is it like we'd still think that some of the other things we've defined in the backing section make sense, but then you would, when you wanted to say sponsorship or one of the subtypes, it could say, well, actually, it's just a reference to this other funding field.
I would assume that we would want it to only be a reference. Sorry, someone else was talking.
Oh, no. I was mostly agreeing with what you're saying, but I was agreeing, and then you said only be a reference. So I actually think the cleanest way forward would be for us to define a way for it to be a reference and leave basically the rest in place. So I say that mostly because we have some semantics in the spec that we have today that I think are valuable, and if a author of a package wants to duplicate some of that across the two areas for a reason that makes sense to them, I'm not super opposed to that. But I think it would be uncommon once we actually get into the weeds on it. Once a lot of people have implemented it, that it would most likely be a reference. But the reason I say that it might be separate is because if you were doing something like a tier, like say you had to sponsor over a certain tier, right? to get that specific support of that specific version. You might put in the sponsor, or I guess the funding, or I guess I have to get the keys right. You might put in the funding that you accept GitHub sponsors, and you might put in the support side that in order to achieve this level of support, you need this sponsorship with this tier, right? And so having sort of a bit on both sides, I actually think might make this more powerful in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying, although we haven't necessarily bound the two different sections together, but it is interesting that, like, you could say for a particular version, these are the funding mechanisms, and yeah. So I guess the key question here is, before we flip back to discussing the actual original PR, is, I guess, you know, Darcy, you want some more direct feedback on the RFC itself.
Yeah, that would be super helpful, just to get folks' input there. And again, I want to preface this with we don't know if this would be a long-term solution compared to, I think, the scope of the work that has been done for support, which is why, again, we didn't want to clobber a keyword. We didn't want to essentially try to take on too much as well. Like, we are ready to de-scope this RFC if it comes down to it being a single URL, then that's fine with us, and not having it be an object, because we really need to move forward and do something. And I think that that will then at least give the community something to be using and to be seeing if there's value there. And then, you know, ideally, I would love to ship the object, because it does provide a mechanism to see what the community then, like, considers to be the, identifiable buckets for funding. I'm in the mindset that not only would you want to be identifying means of how to fund, but you could be identifying existing backers or funding in the exact same object. So similar, a good example would be, I have a Patreon site that you can go to and fund me, but then I may have an array of patrons who supported that specific version of the package that I would want to list, and they would have had paid a certain tier, and then they got added to essentially that array, that then would then be, a part of that package JSON, right? So that's where I think that there's flexibility there to not only reference existing funding URLs, but then also, the future how to fund future contributions can be made here, and so that's kind of the idea behind that, or at least the lens like I take when I think about that being useful for me as a package maintainer. So
yeah, and I think that's in line with the backend.
In terms of making progress, like on getting it to whatever the finish line is, and I know we're waiting to hear back feedback. If I recall, the original reason that we were breaking down the object into multiple parts and considering which parts are going to be referenced by URL, or at least have the option to be referenced, it was because we wanted the flexibility to be able to make updates to it without a full publish. So I'm curious, what would be the blockers for putting out a version 1 of how this is supposed to work, to see how the community begins to use it? What are the issues that we have yet to resolve in terms of, I mean, especially if we're talking about giving the option for providing a link that could be changed at any time? Why not, like, what's slowing our decision for, like, getting out a first draft? Like,
so that I want to dive into a little bit. Like Darcy mentioned, that if we could agree on just a URL, that would be an alternative as well, right? Is that what I heard you say, or make sure I'm not interpreting?
Yeah, so the Pharos came back with the first piece of feedback and just said, let's limit the scope of this to just the URL. Now, I want to be mindful. I think there was a note there about updating that URL at any point. That's not the idea here. I think this would be, you'd have to be updating this on publish.
Okay, so what you were talking about was a single URL in the package JSON versus a structure. Okay, that was different from what I thought I heard. So that's good.
Because what I thought the original issue was that if you have like version 3 of your, or whatever, version 1.0.1, and you go to version 1.0.2 and you have different support, would there be some sort of accountability for 1.0.1 to continue to provide the level of support for anyone that continues to use the older version, based on the support, that we said that we would provide in the object.
But I think that's right. So that's back to the discussion on the original issue, which is the latest kind of proposal we had was a URL, and then with the contents of that being pulled into the package.json on publish, which is what we talked about last week.
Yeah,
I guess.
So the pushback on that was mostly centered around the NPM's responsibility for doing that, and that, to Jordan's point, if you don't have, there's the part of our spec which is really trying to be binding, which is different from the funding stuff. So the not having a URL has been a sticking point for our spec, because we have some parts where we want them to be binding based on version publishes.
But
then the funding stuff is separate in conceptually, because it can change irrespective of versions, which is why it's sort of a natural way to slice this if that is our sticking point.
But
so I do recall having the page, like the NPM page, loading the data from a URL, but I don't recall it being related to publish based on our previous conversations, because I thought the whole point was that NPM's site would show the data per the spec in the published JSON. But if you changed it, it would load whatever the new data was, whenever the page loads. But it wouldn't only change the data that shows up on the NPM page related to the module, because there was a publish. Like, I thought it was decoupling the publish process from the ability to update the data that's shown on the NPM module, because you have like a single source of truth about the type of funding or the type of support that you're providing, that you can update independently of publishing, but it would still show up on the NPM page. I thought that's
what we're hoping for, but that's something that NPM has not yet committed to. I don't expect Darcy to do so on this call. But updating the README without a publish has been a request for most of the life of NPM. And this is basically the same type of thing.
But also going back to the original discussion is, I don't think, like Wes, and other people can correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is not that we're worried about a commitment, right? I mean, the package maintainer can change what they support for any version at any time. This is not a contract that an old version will be supported forever or anything like that. It was around having the information available in the package itself versus having a URL where you might have to go get that data. I guess LJ could comment on that.
Be a contract, though, if we put it in the actual version, there would be no decoupling of the commitment that we claim to be making for an older version. And however we're feeling like later on, like right now, there's not a commitment, but we'd be creating.
Hold on. Let me clarify. The current plan had been to inline the data in package JSON, but to have the implied part of the spec be that whatever was tagged latest on NPM always trumped all other versions of the support field, which means that yes, you can update it at any time. Whether it is legally binding or not is entirely a separate issue that we're not touching, that's related to like local laws and what you actually write in the field and blah, blah, blah. It's more that so by having it inlined in the package JSON, the benefits of that were that you can obtain the data without downloading the entire tarball, and that it could be stored in the NPM registry, which is the only reliable data source. The additional ability for NPM to allow that data, any data, to be updated without a publish, and to show the, just like they show the latest README, to show the latest support data on the website. The latter is something that's probably easy for them to do. The former is probably trickier, but like it would be ideal if we got NPM to commit to and then ship those features. And with that, we'd be able to be more flexible in what we could do with the format of that data. But without that, we were kind of proceeding multi-tiered, as saying, assuming that we never get that commitment from NPM, that the only downside would be then that you are required to publish something as latest in order to like a patch version or whatever, in order to change your support information, just as you are currently required to do so in order to change the README.
Right, now,
yeah, so that's just the current state of things based on our discussions so far.
right. So that reflects my understanding, and I guess it's, you know, we have a number of people who think that this data, and to be honest, I think any of this data can change. So I know there's been some mention of like some is less changeable than others, but to be honest, you know, the package maintainer can change, I think, any of this data. So
Right.
and there's some people, you know, there's a group that feel that because of that, you know, having it actually be something that's in the package JSON that's tied to a publish doesn't make a lot of sense. Because you should really get the most current data. I know that, you know, you feel the opposite, that it should be there. And so the latest sort of compromise attempt was to say, and this obviously, you know, would be the long-term solution, not saying we could get there today, would be like, does it make sense that it actually is a URL, but then to address the issues of the data being available in the package, you know, offline, is that when you do a publish, it actually pulls the data from the URL and adds it to the package. Now, thinking about it, that doesn't necessarily have to go into package JSON. It could be another file in the package as well. But some way where, you know, so the URL could be in the package JSON, the file could be pulled in, and then effectively that would give you the data that's, and it would be as good as it would be under the other proposals, in that, you know, you have to publish a new time, because once you publish it, you get the newer version, right?
And that's a reasonable compromise, and as long as NPM is willing to add make an internet request and validate it as part of the pre-publish process, if they're willing to add that to the CLI, which is a much lower impact thing to add than the like update in place without publishing, right. Then sure, that would work. But if it's not part of the CLI, if a failure in validating that data doesn't block publishing, for example, then I don't think it's going to work as well. Now, I'm not suggesting that a failure in inline data to validate would block publishing, but that's like, I think there's a difference if you're fetching a remote resource and you suddenly get a 404 and HTML, you know, or 503 and HTML floods down. Like, you wouldn't want a package JSON to have some 3 megabyte 503 page, because then that would make installing the package slow and would probably break NPM a little bit. So like I like the compromise, but it requires, it also, in a way that the inline one doesn't, it requires some commitment from NPM.
So I guess the question then to Darcy was like, does that, not a commitment to say do it now, but does that model make any sense or make no sense, right? Because if the model makes no sense, then it's not something worth considering.
Yeah, like it would have to be, it's definitely extra overhead for us to manage that commitment, like and ensuring that resource that you're downloading is what you expect. And, you know, to Jordan's like point, it's not like 10 gigabytes that you're trying to like download to somebody's, you know, like,
right. I mean, the implementation is relatively trivial, right? Like, it's the equivalent of like a node thing where you do curl, pipe that stream to, that has a cap on it, to a JSON validator, and then if anything goes wrong, it craps out, like, and tells you remove the field from your package JSON to keep publishing. But NPM would still have to be willing to do that.
And we'd have to be willing to take the performance hit if we go first. Then
I have my concern about it is that, to me, it sounds more like it's just so fundamentally different from what NPM does itself, that to me it sounds like a different code, and we can just like hook using maybe like a pre-published hook, and like, but it sounds like a different tool than just trying to bake that into NPM itself.
So that's actually, I'm glad you said that, because that was what I was going to maybe propose, would be, is there any opportunity for us to run some sidecar infrastructure when we have ideas like this? If the problem is NPM's got to foot the bill, which I don't want you to have to do. I mean, it doesn't make sense for you to have to add these features, add the, you know, this infrastructure if you don't already have it, and if it's a big ask, is there any way that we could work with maybe the foundation and get the foundation to add, to get some donated hardware and run a server that we, build the feature set for, and we get some webhooks on NPM side, and all that it is a webhook that calls to this, sidecar service. The sidecar service does the validation. We, as the package maintenance team and the node, infrastructure group or whatever, could manage it, and it would just be sitting there on the side, so that NPM doesn't have to do any of the problematic stuff, which is, dedicate engineering resources, pay for the servers, field the extra bandwidth, right? Like, if we could just offload that onto some other organization, would that actually make these kind of requests, not just this one in particular, but other ones that we might, come up with as the group, more feasible?
I think this one though doesn't require any, like, it's purely client side, right? So there's no infrastructure in NPM. It's purely a client, and as LJ said, it's as simple as curl JSON validate. If it's okay, you include the file in the publish. If it's not, so it's like once it's in the client, there's no extra load or.
So, but just imagine how many dependencies you're gonna have to make that curl request for. So this is not necessarily, and Wes, I'm totally on board with figuring out ways that we can be more collaborative and find, interesting ways that we can unblock future development. So definitely want to take that offline somehow and figure out that. But in this particular case, it's not an infrastructure problem or like overhead on our end. There is some backlog work, like once we decide on what the actual approach is. But I think right now we're still even discussing like how this would be utilized on the client side, let's say, and like pulling down a file and having that be available offline. That functionality, I guess, in my mind, I would be hesitant to get NPM to implement because of the extra overhead that it would add to installs. So,
well, sorry, to be clear, the overhead would be at publish time, and it would create a file that then gets packed up. So you would even run it before you ran npm pack, and so it would add zero overhead to anyone's installs, and it would only be a performance hit for the author who added it to their package JSON during publish time.
So what's the difference? I don't quite understand. If you're creating an artifact at publish time, and what's the difference in publishing with,
I think it's just having
in the package?
Some of the folks who have expressed concern about the inline approach don't like the idea of just vomiting more stuff into package JSON. So I think that the benefit that some people see there is that they have one line that's a URL instead of adding a bunch of support data, and then that URL can separately maintain.
The other key thing is that we've also said that the URL would be the source of truth. So the URL in the package.json would be like, if you want to actually get the latest value, you would use that URL, you'd get the latest data.
Right.
And so it addresses I think this should be the latest up-to-date thing. So you get that for people who think that's. On the flip side, for people who are concerned about being able to get the data without having to do a URL request, or having to do, being able to get it from the NPM repository and having it offline in a package, you get that as well. And you could do it. You could basically say, well, what you need to do is add a URL to your package.json and add this file to what you publish, right? But the complaint I think LJ would come up with on that is it's not very ergonomic, and nobody's going to do that, right?
Well, and that's two sources of truth. Whereas if you're automatically pulling from the URL every time, then that's just one. And then that's right. That does solve the kind of offline, like if I don't have internet, I can still look at the last published version. But whenever I do have internet, I go to the URL and get the latest. And the URL would always trump whatever was in the artifact. Yeah. So that's essentially what the compromise ask would be, Darcy, is adding that curl to size capped JSON validator in, and then picking a file name like package lock JSON or something, but picking a file name that could just be dumped into the file system, and like that whatever that file name was would have to be something that was permanently npm ignored, just like package lock JSON is, so that we could be sure that it could always, that it only. But that I think would also be relatively trivial.
What's the ignore part?
Well, you'd want to make sure if we called it support.json. You'd want to make sure that anyone who had published that, like, nobody could publish a package that had a support.json in it that like conflicted, or that if I was publishing a package with a support.json, npm would overwrite that file as part of publishing. Like you wouldn't want that behavior.
Yeah, so that's, I sort of made that comment in the thread. I also made the comment that definitely the two sources of truth doesn't make sense, even in the interim. I'm wondering if this is a case for just creating a tool like outside of npm to test this. Like I know there's other publishing tools like NP or something that we could be asking to ship this kind of support in there, or like, again, it seems a little, it's going to be tough for us to support something that I think is going to clobber any like existing files or mutates what is going to go into your package.
Well, so as far as mutates what goes into your package, I mean, like the npm already like has permanently ignored files. For example, no matter what you have on disk, there's some things it won't pick up, and it should be really quick, I assume, to run a query inside npm with a couple example file names and verify that 0 packages existed that had that file name. And then like whatever that file name was wouldn't have, as long as it doesn't clobber anything in existence, like nobody will ever use it again, because like, and then as far as shipping in a separate tool, to me, if it's not in npm, it doesn't count. And the definition of the correct behavior is what npm does, full stop. And anyone that like breaks that in terms of effective user visibility, like they're the ones that are broken. And that's just the position npm happens to be in. So like, I think that what we can certainly build a tool easily that would do this stuff and like demo it. If it's not actually part of npm, if it doesn't happen when you type npm publish by default, then like, when you have the key in your package JSON, then it's just not, it's almost not worth the effort, in my opinion.
I'd add a couple things too, is like, one is, I don't think we need npm to do the work. Like, I think I assume PRs could be made externally, right? So in terms of adding it, that.
Oh
that
yeah, it's about being willing for them to accept the work.
Exactly.
Obviously,
So,
anyone else could write it. Yeah.
Right. So it's about willing. So it's not actually the work to make it done. I wonder too, though, if LJ, there's some variations on, like, instead of overwriting an existing file, the tool could warn and basically say, oh, by the way, you have an existing file.
Sure.
And
so it could just error out. It could just kill the publish and be like, you can't have this file in your package if you also have the funding key, because we'll automatically overwrite it with the contents of that URL, right? Or something. And that would be friction for the people that want to add the key and already have the file, but
that's
presumably no one has
rare, right?
So. Yeah.
Wasn't one of the issues the fact that, like, what's the point of putting that file on npm if it's going to be outdated? If you put it at publish time and then the author changes the information in the URL and nothing ever updates based on that until they publish, then this is all pointless as well.
So the URL would still be in package JSON. So any tooling we wrote would prioritize the URL, but people operate offline. And what if I don't have internet access and I'm curious what the support is for the package? Like that, I want to be able to get to that information without depending on the internet. And similarly, if I'm in a company and I'm deploying, theoretically, I have no dependency on the outside internet for my deployment if I'm following decades of best practices. And so if part of my deployment process in CI includes validating support information somehow, I shouldn't need to make any curl requests or internet queries to validate that. And my private npm registry would hold all that information with either of the two inline suggestions. So the fact that it's parsed temporarily out of date sometimes is just not a concern, because like if it is a concern, I can go look at the internet. But like the issue is when I don't have internet, I still want non-zero value.
So I just
if the client, you would do something like npm view in the client, you would get the version from the URL. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
So I just want to be mindful of time, because and I know that this is a conversation we've had multiple times with similar sort of outcomes and conversations. So we only have 10 minutes left here. But just on that, I guess, last point, I would love to know how folks are doing this today, like in those scenarios where you're offline and you need to know support information. Are people using the license information in terms of their understanding of what is supported? Like, in terms of prior art, this is the reason why we decided to bite off the funding aspect, because there was so much existing tooling and the community had done so much work around how they thought best to move forward in that aspect. I'm just wondering how much prior art there is around this scenario in which I'm offline and I need to know what the support level is of the packages. Like that, exactly what you're saying in the CI/CD environment. How are people working around the lack of a tool and the lack of that information today?
Well, I would say it's the same as the way they're handling, the way that licenses were handled prior to the SPDX compliant license field. The answer is they weren't. They were just crossing their fingers and hoping it was cool. So like essentially we're creating the ability to have use cases here by having first-class NPM support, and lacking it, I mean, I ran open source Airbnb for 4 years, and prior to like integrating licensee into CI, I just had to wait until the lawyers asked me what the licenses were, and then I had to like write some tooling to spit out a list, and then they sent it to a contracted attorney's office to laboriously review, and that's like just not practical or tenable, and now it's trivial. And so the same thing, if I want to know what percentage of my stack like is maintained at all, has any sort of maintenance as opposed to abandoned, there's just no way to do that right now, because there's no standard form. But if the standard form existed at all, then that gives me something. And if the standard form exists in a way that doesn't require internet access, then I can validate it as part of my CI process.
Right. So then I would, again, like I would go back to then something that you brought up yourself, like how binding is this contract, based on the fact that every license, open source license, pretty much distributes with it as is, and best effort pretty much a term. So I'm just wondering, like, this is what we're trying to do here. Is that superseding that sort of contract that the package?
I wouldn't even use the word contract. I think that's dangerous. I mean, we're trying to provide more information. I don't think this tries to form a contract or a commitment. It's like, this is what I'm telling you. If you actually want to get into a legal agreement in terms of support, it's providing you the information for how to contact the package maintainer or the company to do that. I don't think you form that agreement through this.
Right. Well, and then like in the category of licenses, right? Like the lawyers for my company were concerned with like risk level, and that's always a spectrum. It's not binary. And like if something claimed that it was a certain license, then that was low enough risk that we could be okay with it. Whereas if something claimed it was a different license, then that was a high risk, and we wanted to resolve that somehow as quickly as possible. I would say the same as with support, right? Like something being unmaintained is a risk. It's not like, that doesn't guarantee, like maybe I could file a GitHub issue and it'll get responded to immediately, but like if we might want to mitigate risk by saying like, let's try and maximize how much of our stack is supported explicitly, and like a tool helps us do that. There's no like binding anything here, no contract, no legal requirement. It's just kind of a reporting mechanism. And the more we make it easy to keep it up to date and to also work in offline scenarios, then the more information everyone has to work with.
Right now, I'm back to Darcy's question. I think a little bit about like adoption and previous practice. I can see a case to be made to say that, what you could do is you could say, well, here's what we recommend you do. And today it's a manual process. We recommend you add the URL and then if you want to include include the file, which is like the current state. And then based on stats as to how many people we've got including that file, you've got a stronger case to be made that the client itself should just do the update automatically. So like, I don't know if, LJ would be strong enough if NPM was saying, well, this isn't a crazy idea. So if we saw the uptake of people doing that, then we'd be more open to getting it into the client versus we've got to put it in the client right from the beginning in terms of the automatic update. And I mean, Darcy, maybe let me know if that actually makes any difference.
That's totally exactly like where I'm going with that. So like again, when I was trying to find prior art for this type of like the rest of the support schema, which is why we also narrowed in on, again, the funding. It was just, there was leaps and bounds more like package maintainers trying to solve that one problem versus this other problem of the extra metadata around like the level. Like
that's because this isn't a maintainer problem; it's a consumer problem. So obviously, maintainers aren't going to care about it as much. Whereas funding is a maintainer problem. I mean, there's a lot of overlap, but like But I just something I mentioned in chat real quick. The compromise, Michael, that you suggested. One of the benefits of having an inline is that I don't have to download the tarball to get the information. I can do npm view package name like support, and the information comes out. If it's a separate file, I lose that.
Right.
So like, but so Darcy, I don't know if the package JSON is modified anyway between what's published and what's local. So is that something is theoretically trivial to modify prior to the pack running? Like, I think it's modified on the server, not locally, but like.
Yeah, it is.
Or alternatively, I guess that would be the server side work, is like, if we could make it so that the contents of this separate file, like, were inlined in the package JSON on the server. So that's another opportunity, is it could be a URL, the client could store the file in there, but then if npm inlined the file in the server at, something like that, like, it would be really, if we had a thing where all these constraints were met somehow, and like there was a URL so it could be kept up to date, it was viewable without downloading the tarball, and there's only one source of truth, and it's not so large, and it's like valid and small enough, right? Like, it feels like we would be in a really good place, regardless of what exact schema we come up with. We'd be in a place where we'd have defined a new standard that can meet all of these things, and we'd also have created a precedent for how schemas can be like maximally useful for things that could change, like support. I don't know what else, I haven't had any like fever dreams about what else it could be, but like, if this sort of mechanism is viable, then like that is a useful precedent to set up.
Is it not the case that package JSON cannot be modified server-side because that would break the hash of the tarball?
No, talking about the package information, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, because npm view pulls the package, not the package JSON in the tarball, but they're built from it. So I don't actually care if it's in the tarball if the npm, if the npm view can pull it, because I'm not worried about, I'm worried about not having a connection to the public registry. I'm not worried about having no internet at all, to be honest.
Yeah, I know there are some people who that is their use case of not having any connection, right?
Right. No, that's true. But also there's also a bunch of properties in the local package JSON, but I think the client puts that there on install. So we'd have to answer these questions.
But I mean, if it's a separate file and it's local, like you've installed the package, you already.
Oh yeah, that's right. If it's a separate file in the tarball, but that file is inlined into the package, then all the use cases are met. Where it's a separate file, it's outside of package JSON, you have the URL, it's validated at publish time, and npm view can still show it without needing to download the tarball. So you're right, that would actually work. It requires a server-side integration to inline it into the package. It requires a client-side integration on publish to download and validate the file. But with those two pieces, I feel like we've checked all the boxes.
But I mean, I guess
in theory, you could potentially have a way to update the package at some point in the future, updating the inline information without modifying the tarball.
I think that was definitely always the ideal. I think we've talked about this before for sure. Like if there's going to be mutable data, something needs to change, then that would be the ideal, is that you can update it there at any time without requiring a publish. So I think we've talked about that. It's just something that I think has been backlogged in my mind, and it hasn't been something that we've agreed to yet, based on, I would like to see maybe adoption of the schema or sort of other sort of areas of this rounded out.
Right, but back to, I think we only talked about the npm view when the only source was in the files itself, right? Like if we're at the point where The source of truth is the URL. So that's how you get the latest. You don't go to the latest published to get it. You go to that URL. I'm not sure the npm view matters anymore because you've installed your module, you get the extra file. So you've got what you're going to get unless you want to get something more recent. And if you want something more recent, you use the URL that was in the package.json.
I might have access to my internal registry, but not the external internet, as in most production machines. So npm view would let me
I think we're now getting to the nice to have, right?
All right, fair.
Like I'm, it's the, you've got, if we can say that a stale version is good sometimes, I think we've probably reached the bar where like, yeah, it might be really nice, but it sounds like it's an extra bar and I don't want to block it. I prefer not to block on that.
Oh, right. I'm saying that I want to be able to get the stale version without access to the external internet without downloading a tarball. So npm view would be the only way to do that.
What's the case for that? Like, I think it's like if you've already—
when I'm trying to validate a dependency graph without having to run npm install first, because that's slow and downloads a bunch of files.
Yeah, I was worried about having to download the latest version, right, to get the updated data, but having to install it once doesn't seem like a big ask.
I mean, that was the whole point of npm view, right? Is that I don't even have to install it once.
Right.
Like
no, I thought when we discussed earlier, the point is like, okay, when you do the install, you're going to get a potentially stale version. I want to, if I'm running my check, and I don't think people are going to run this every time. It's sort of like, as part of your release process, you're going to say, I want to check that my data is still valid. So you're going to want the latest stuff. And if you have to re-download, so you basically have to install the version you're using and download the latest as well to get the data. That seemed like a valid concern.
All right. Sorry, just one note. We are over time, so I don't know who all has to head out. So if somebody wants to, I'm not sure, but we should update the ticket with whatever feedback we need to keep the conversation moving forward. This is part of the reason that I had the kind of like ticket template or issue template kind of on the agenda, is to decide in advance before we start the kind of discussion what we think would be a good way to close the conversation out, so that we can kind of work towards an endpoint. And I'm not sure I understand yet what the exact endpoint is for this yet. I know we've talked about a lot of hypothetical options, and everybody that needed to be involved in the conversation was here, and so that was really productive, I think. But we need to maybe make a pinned down list of what we're actually going to go ahead and do. And I think we can do it.
I mean, sorry. I was trying to get to the point where I think we're closer than we were.
Yeah,
the one that's in my mind is a potential way forward, and I don't know if everybody would agree, but I think recapping that and seeing, so is that, we have the URL. We would say to start with, well, you're going to have to put the file in yourself, and that might be okay, provided that on the npm side we get some feedback that says, if we see people adopting that and we start to see packages that have that extra file in the URL in it, then it makes sense to optimize that for people by saying, well, when you have the URL, we will suck down the content, put it into a file, and it would make sense to actually have that in the CLI. If the answer is, well, no, that still doesn't make sense in the CLI, then we're no further ahead. But if it does, maybe that helps us with a path forward.
So I might be able to make a commitment to, if we start to see that support URL, we can bubble that up on the website first, as a very almost immediate action on our end.
Right, and is it conceivable that what we've described in terms of if it's there, if this was being used by everybody, that the client would then actually help you by keeping the two in, populating the one that's published so that you don't have to manually manage those two.
That I think needs a little bit more discussion, just based on, it's the first time I've sort of thought about it like that.
Okay.
It sounds to me also that we're missing the place to put it where we share that URL, since we're just retrieving it someplace. So I don't know if that's something that we would add to the repo. So it's not necessarily published, but the repo has one file that we're retrieving. Is that a way that we could get our initial rendering it on the page? Is that, because that's what we're talking about, right? Grabbing it from someplace?
the short term thing we would be talking about is an extra entry in the package.json and then a new file which has the content, which, you know, to start with is a manual, you know, copy of what you would get if you went to the URL.
So it's still publish first, and then it shows up on NPM's website. Is that right?
In fact, I mean, I think the first step would be nothing new, right? Like today, any package maintainer could add a URL and they could add a file.
I'm just confirming it. I'm not opposed to it or anything.
So sorry, it's just that we had a lot of discussion about URLs, and the problem being LJ raised initially is, well, there's no reliable place. If we say it's GitHub, that can go away. If we say it's somewhere else, you know, there could be broken links, and we seem to be going in a little circular thing. We've gone back to that, and won't that point just be raised again? Or,
well, but this is the, I mean, we would be saying there's both.
Right, but you're saying that there's the possibility that the CLI will automate the file. Like if everyone has to manually do it, nobody's going to do it,
right.
And so we would that would only be an acceptable option if we were content with that never progressing farther. And my original point would say that I'm not.
Okay, well, that's what I'm looking for, areas of compromise, right? Like it's, you know, there's so that's what I was trying to poke at. Is it like the you know, if NPM says, well, that makes sense, but I'd like to see some uptake first. But it sounds like from your position, it's like, no, it's got to be there from the beginning or forget it.
Regarding the URL, so let's just take a very quick step back. If the URL points to the support JSON, and the support JSON in all likelihood will be on GitHub, and that will be in the repo next to the package JSON. So it's like it's going to be pointing to the same repo that you're publishing. So if the support JSON file exists, the client just before publish time can fill in the URL from the Git information that it already has. Or it can even inline the file or do the other way around, right? Do all three. Like if there's a support key in the package JSON, just create a support JSON, push it back to Git, then there's your URL. And if it goes away, you have a static copy of the latest version that you had before included in the tarball in the package.
Yeah. Right. I think that's what we're trying to get at is like, can we get a compromise that says, yes, you've got this URL, you've got the static copy, and you know, I think, you know, so it sounded like there was some agreement that if we had those two, but then the concern was like over, will people keep them up to date? And so you need tooling. And then the next question was like, well, okay, is there any compromise around like, well, the tooling has to be there from the very beginning, or is it something where like, if we think the tooling makes sense, but we wait till there's adoption to put it in place, is that possible? Or no, it just has to be there from the beginning, right, to move forward?
I can't see any way that if the tooling is not there from the beginning, that it's really going to work out, because people are not going to do it unless the tooling does it for them.
So when we're saying tooling, we could mean that, you know, tooling is npm publish, but if there existed some alternative way which automatically does that for you as part of pre-publish or something, we could, well, we couldn't, but npm could measure whether there's any response. And if there's no response, then we need to decide whether it's the tooling or not the tooling. If it's the tooling, we can try to tweak the tooling. If it's you know, marketing, then we can. But the MVP, I think we can work with something. Like, I mean,
you can do it, man. I mean, we could basically say we recommend you do this. It's include a URL which points to the file you want, also include the file. So like you could do that fully manually now.
Yeah, and we could add in an extra tool, and our recommendation could be run npx magic a URL, right, and it will do it for you, of course. And that, like, the easier we make it, the better. But like it just doesn't feel like it feels like people are just going to manually stick a URL in their thing, or they're not going to add it to pre-publish. And like, so the benefit here is that you can rely on when this file exists, it always was correct at that time, you know. And if But if the tooling, if NPM specifically isn't enforcing anything around it, then that file could be literally anything. And it might not even be JSON, right? And like, so any tooling that processes that information will then have to cover that use case. Whereas like tooling that deals with package-lock.json knows that if that file is present, it is a valid lock file. Like,
So
NPM won't allow it otherwise.
I think I totally
I'm not
agree
sure.
with you, except that I don't think doing nothing is better than that.
Long
Which
term,
is
no.
maybe the alternative, right?
I have to drop. So, but I was hoping, again, just to circle back to at least the first step towards a portion of this is maybe that funding spec, and then we can continue to have the discussion about how we can maybe write some tooling to support the support spec in the intro. Not maybe necessarily inside of NPM, but maybe again pre-published scripts or whatever it looks like. To see if there's some adoption of this.
Well, and I'll definitely give a thorough review to that funding PR, the RFC, later today.
Awesome.
With thoughts relevant to this.
And as far as the tooling goes, I have that package that I published. We also have the package on the Node repository. We never resolved that where we want to be doing that work, but I'm happy to make that tool that I started the thing that does what we want based on this discussion. Whatever we think we need there, we can have a CLI that writes to your package JSON and inlines the URL you specified. I mean, anybody can go in there and start adding stuff. I'll add you to the repo right away. Either that or we didn't even get to the discussion of where do we want the tools to be.
Right. Yeah, sorry, I think this was a good discussion to have though, because I think we really want to close on can we move forward with a recommendation or not? But like to Darcy's point about having something that we can start to get feedback on and talk to the community about, and it may change, but it would be great to get it beyond our discussion and get it out there. Maybe we'll get the feedback that points us in a different direction, but saying let's suggest and try this out would be. And so anyway, I guess from my perspective, it was good to see if we could get closer to resolution on that. Are there any other issues that people think we really need to talk about as well that were urgent, since we didn't get to the rest of the agenda?
Do we want to talk about the tooling piece? If we're going to start trying to build something to help with this particular problem, we need to have a decision on where we're building it.
I mean, we can build it in where it's currently at for now, right? And then if we want to move it somewhere later, we can. And if we should build it anyway, because the same code hopefully will be usable in a PR to NPM if it comes to that. Absolutely. So I don't see any reason to delay working on the tooling.
Yeah, and I think doing it where it is now is fine too. So.
Well, we say where it is now, there's 2 copies. So are we saying we're going to, right, there's the one that is called package compliant in the Node repository, or in the Node organization rather. And then there's the other one that I started, which is just my offshoot.
Right, and I think there's a number of, but I mean, there's more than one in the org that you have, so maybe it's best to just keep them all there.
I like package.js.
Right?
Is that where the other one was?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to keep.
Yeah, let's just keep it in there for now.
Keep building tools in there. Yeah.
Okay, then do you want me to invite the entire working group? Do you all want to go and make a list of who wants access? Like, what do you want me to do for management there?
I know that the NPM CLI team would love to help you out with this dashboard stuff because we've done something similar. So if you can, I can provide a whole bunch of names.
Yeah, should I, let's see. Yeah, you can just shoot those to me offline, and then I'll maybe also make a like discussions repo over there so that we can have a space when, see, that's how I'm like, this is why the problem with the other org, and I totally understand this, is now we would have discussions in 2 places. So maybe opening an issue on the package maintenance working group repo with this list of people who want access, so everybody will get a notification and can say, hey, yeah, me too.
Yep.
Would be a good place to start.
And do all of them have licenses? Because I know that's one challenge. Like when I go to request access to new repos, if they don't have a license, I'm gonna have a hard time.
They do,
Okay.
but I think I just have whatever I copy and paste in there. So I'm happy to change or improve those.
Just
They're all
like
pretty.
an MIT license is easy. Other ones
I
become.
think I've just been using the ICS one because that's what NPM puts in as a default. It's not a good reason. ISC, that's what it is. Yeah. So if we have some strong
ISC
recommendations
and MIT
there, I will.
are usually very unoffensive to everyone, so either of those are probably fine.
Okay, I can change
know-
them, and I should also say we'll probably, I think I have my name in there again because that's just part of my scaffold. So we should change it probably to like the package maintenance working group as the license holder or something.
So you said ISC. I'm not sure that's on the list for the.
That's the default one that NPM init suggests,
Right.
and it's functionally equivalent to MIT. So it might not be on the list, in which case you could switch it to MIT, but it's, I'd be surprised if any lawyers cared between the two of them.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, I know that the OpenJS Foundation Board is working on the IP policy. It's going to list a specific set of licenses. Hey, this is the same as something with a different name.
Well, yeah, no,
when the lawyers
ISC
involved
should be
isn't so easy, right?
ISC should absolutely be in the Foundation's list. It's an oversight if it's not.
Well, I'll have to go look. I know MIT is, so I'll just say that one's easy.
I'm happy to change it to whatever.
Yeah.
So
I've not run into a case where MIT's been a problem. Otherwise, I'm not so sure. So if that's possible, that would be the easiest, I think, for.
Cool. Yeah, MIT's fine then. Let's do that.
Okay, so I will. Darcy, are you going to open up an issue with a bunch of people, or do you want me to open the issue and you can comment?
You open the issue and then I'll comment on
Perfect.
it against the folks. And yeah, we'll look forward to contributing to that.
Awesome. And then in that issue, I will also put a little to-do list of things that we need to do to make sure that it's all up to snuff for everyone, which will include changing all the licenses to MIT.
Perfect. Any other key things we should talk about before we close out for today? Because we are, 20 minutes after.
My issue real quick is very, very small, but I was hoping to get a discussion amongst the members. I believe it was the one I opened for just in regard to what's knowing an unmaintained package. And we had some discussion in our company about in regards to this for an open source package. So if any one of the members could just look into that issue, it's 270, I believe. Just start the discussion. I plan on wanting to open a PR to our current draft for that, with adding maybe some more reasonable time frame of what we consider is a reasonable amount of time for contact, or waiting for a contact from, or knowing that a package is unmaintained before forking and redistributing. So I just wanted to bring that up real quick. Thank you.
Okay, any other things? Okay, I guess then we'll close the stream. LG, I'm wondering, do you have time to stick around for a little bit more of a discussion?
I'll have time in like half an hour to chat more if you want to ping me. I'm just about to do an airport pickup, so I really do have to go.
Okay, so I'll try and reach out to you in about 30 minutes.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thanks to everybody who took the time, and we'll catch up to everybody next time.
Thanks, team.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
See you.